Good to have you with us this morning. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Thanks for starting your Tuesday with us. We are going to begin our show in Washington, where President Trump is taking steps to arrange a trilateral meeting with the leaders of Russia and Ukraine in an effort to end the 3.5-year war between the two countries.
Several top European leaders joined Ukraine's President Zelenskyy at the White House yesterday. It was a show of unity aimed at urging President Trump to push Russia's President Putin for a ceasefire. The group also pressed for a commitment from President Trump to help guarantee Ukraine's security as part of any peace deal. It's something the president said the U.S. could help with while meeting with President Zelenskyy at the Oval Office. The Ukrainian leader also expressed support for a trilateral meeting. America, Ukraine, Russia, all at the same table.
There'll be a lot of help. When it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe. But we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
We supported the idea of the United States, of personally President Trump, to stop this war, to make a diplomatic way of finishing this war. And we are ready for trilateral, as President said. This is a good signal about trilateral. I think this is very good.
In a few moments, we'll speak with the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. First, though, let's get out to Washington and NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor. So, Yamiche, yesterday's meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy was a day and night compared with that tense sit-down that we saw in February. Tell us a little more about what we heard from them and just how soon could we see this trilateral meeting?
Well, yesterday's meeting, as you said, was vastly different than what we saw in February when President Zelenskyy was literally shown the door at the White House. This time he received a warm welcome. The two men sat down, President Trump, President Zelenskyy, side by side. They talked about shared goals. It was really, in some ways, not a contentious meeting. They did also talk specifically about what Ukraine would need in order to really be able to bring this war to an end. And President Trump was very sort of accepting and welcoming of the idea that Ukraine needed to be at the table and that Russia needed to face consequences if this war continues to drag on. Now, one of the big issues here, while these meetings were productive and everyone came out saying that they were good, there's a big issue of a ceasefire. President Trump, before he met with President Putin, said that he wanted to see a ceasefire almost immediately and then wanted to see a longer-term peace deal. European leaders yesterday continued to say that they wanted that, but President Trump wavered on that and has actually changed his mind and said that he doesn't want a ceasefire, he doesn't need a ceasefire, rather, and that if a ceasefire happened, it would be good, but that ultimately he feels like a peace deal can be negotiated. So that's just one of the points of contention. We do know that there is movement toward this trilateral meeting, but before that meeting happens, there's going to be a bilateral meeting within the next 2 weeks between Russia and Ukraine, based on our reporting. Joe, Savannah.
Yamiche, and we know both Ukraine and Europe have been pushing the U.S. for security guarantees for Ukraine. Do we know at this stage what President Trump might be willing to offer?
It's a key question. It's not clear exactly what the U.S. is willing to offer, though the president as well as European leaders say that they want some sort of NATO-like security guarantees for Ukraine. Of course, a big question there is not just, of course, supplies and aid, but whether or not they would actually be defensive forces on the ground for Ukraine if there was to be even more Russian aggression. The president yesterday, in an extraordinary move and an extraordinary statement, did not rule out putting U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. So that's a big deal. We have to watch to see sort of how this evolves. But the president essentially opening that door really is something that's striking in this moment. Joe, Savannah.
And Yamiche, we understand the president later spoke on the phone with President Putin. What came out of that? Is the president convinced the Russian leader wants to make a peace deal, especially if those security guarantees you just mentioned are on the table?
Well, it's very interesting. The two men talked for about 40 minutes after all of these meetings yesterday. And it's interesting that you asked that because President Trump, while he was speaking to the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, was actually heard on a microphone saying this: I think he wants to make a deal. Speaking of Putin, I think he wants to make a deal for me. You understand that? As crazy as that sounds. So that President Trump essentially signaling and saying directly that Vladimir Putin wants to essentially make a deal to try to sort of get in his good graces. We also saw a number of posts and statements come out after these meetings. I want to read to you part of what President Trump posted online. He said, I called President Putin and began the arrangements for a meeting at a location to be determined between President Putin and President Zelenskyy. After that meeting takes place, we will have a trilateral meeting, which would be the two presidents plus myself. Again, this was a very good early step to a war that has been going on for almost 4 years. We also saw a statement come out from Russia, a foreign affairs aide to Vladimir Putin, saying that President Putin and President Trump expressed support for further continuation of direct negotiation between the delegations of Russia and Ukraine. In this regard, an idea was discussed that it would make sense to examine a possibility of raising the level of representatives of the Ukraine and Russia, which is interesting because essentially what that's saying is that there could actually be direct talks between Vladimir Putin and President Zelenskyy, which had been something that we hadn't seen before. Joe, Savannah.
All right, Yamiche, thank you so much. A lot to cover there. Yamiche just mentioned French President Emmanuel Macron, who sat down for an exclusive interview with Meet the Press moderator Kristen Welker. Macron said he was skeptical that Russian President Vladimir Putin wanted peace with Ukraine. Here's some of their conversation.
I think the optimism of your president is to be taken seriously. So if he considers he can get a deal done, this is a great news, and we have to do whatever we can to have a great deal being fixed, concluded. But a great deal is a deal with security guarantees and a robust peace. As far as I'm concerned, when I look at the situation and the facts, I don't see President Putin really willing to get peace now. But perhaps I'm too pessimistic. I don't see any swap in the proposal of the Russians, except a swap in comparison with what they wanted at the beginning. But let me be clear on territory. They got a lot of territories after the first phase of the war between February and summer 2022. But because the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people did organize themselves very impressively, because we organized unprecedented support, they managed to push them back at the end of the second semester of 2022. And if you take the situation between November 2022 and now, more than 1,000 days of war, the Russian army took less than 1% of the Ukrainian territory. All of us, we want peace. All of us, from day one. And this is very important. Second, all of us are very clear that we want to stop the killings as soon as possible. You can call it a ceasefire, you can call it a truce, an armistice, but we want to stop these killings. Number three, all of us, we are clear about the fact that we want a robust and long-standing peace, which means no peace without what we call security guarantees.
Our thanks to Kristen Welker for bringing us that conversation. Let's now bring in William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador, good morning. Thanks, as always, for being with us. So this meeting yesterday between President Trump and President Zelenskyy, I mean, it was clearly much friendlier than the meeting back in February. And Mr. Trump himself, he said it was a very successful day. How do you see it? What were your takeaways from this meeting?
Savannah, the impressive unanimity, the impressive unity of the Europeans and President Trump and President Zelenskyy, that was a takeaway. I mean, that was a strong support for Ukraine, essentially a strong opposition to the Russian attacks on Ukraine. Good discussions of a ceasefire. You know, they're not quite there yet, but I think they got back to where they were a week ago. You know, a week ago, President Trump and those European leaders, including President Zelenskyy, were on the phone, and they agreed ceasefire was a top priority going into the Anchorage meeting. And I think they got back on that yesterday, or at least back toward that yesterday. It was a good discussion. And the other big thing, Savannah, was what President Macron just said, that is security guarantees. A lot of progress making that real with U.S. support of it now. So that I think there were some steps in the right direction yesterday.
So President Trump called Putin yesterday after those talks ended, says he does plan to set up that direct meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin. That trilateral, do you think it's actually going to happen? What is it going to take?
So the bilateral first, and as Yamiche reported, the Russians indicate that they're willing to up the level of their current delegation. It would take a significant upping of that level on the Russian side. The Russians have so far only sent a historian a deputy minister of culture to these discussions with the Ukrainians so far, sporadic as they have been. So if the Russians are now saying they're going to up the level, they got a long way to go. President Zelenskyy has said he's ready to go. He's ready to meet. And he hopes the Russians, he hopes President Putin is brave enough, he said, to show up and have this conversation. So that's the first step. If that happens, and if they make some progress, then the trilateral, Joe, that you asked about, can be scheduled. And I am sure that President Trump would love to have that and be able to bring this war to an end. He's been talking about that since the campaign. And to his credit, he has kept the focus on that, spent a lot of his own time. This has been the major foreign policy priority for him. He'd love to see that trilateral succeed.
Also, if we could talk about the idea here of potential land swaps and sort of some of these hard lines here, because as a condition of ending this 3.5-year-long war, Putin has insisted that Russia retains about 20% of Ukrainian territory that it now controls. Zelenskyy has pointed to the fact that Ukraine's constitution forbids him to cede any land. Do you see that as the biggest hurdle to a peace deal?
So it's interesting, Savannah. The land is an interesting question, and it's an important question, but it didn't much come up yesterday. There was very little talk of territory, and that's probably a good thing. Land swaps, suggesting that the Russians would swap some land for the Ukrainians. Well, no, this is not land swaps. The Russians are now occupying 19% of Ukraine. And the question is, the real question is whether or not the Ukrainians and the Europeans and the Americans will recognize that 19% as part of Russia. That is formally part of Russia. Acknowledge that or bless the Russian takeover of that land. And the Ukrainians will say no, they will not do that. The Europeans will say no, they will not do that. The Americans should say no, they will not do that. But, Savannah, there's one nuance on that. Rather than, no one will recognize the Russian claim for that 19% to be part of Russia. But they will acknowledge, we could acknowledge the fact that the Russians are there, that the Russians are in that 19% and they're not likely to leave in the near future. But holding out the possibility that they could leave that. They could, like the West Germans did after World War II with East Germany. Soviets dominated East Germany. The West Germans wanted to be reunited. They said they wouldn't try to take it back militarily. And as we know, the West Germans finally got East Germany back in Germany's united. The Ukrainians know that history as well. They're willing to acknowledge that they're there. The Russians are there, but they're not going to give them claim to it.
Ambassador William Taylor, thank you so much. Always great to have you.
President Trump made another headline yesterday. He's reigniting his push to change the way elections are conducted across the country ahead of next year's midterms. The president is once again calling to eliminate mail-in voting and vowing to take the action with the stroke of a pen. As NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez explains, it's a fight that will almost certainly end up in court.
President Trump is promising to lead a movement revamping the nation's election system by doing away with mail-in voting.
Mail-in ballots are corrupt. Mail-in ballots, you can never have a real democracy with mail-in ballots.
Despite no evidence of widespread voter fraud, the president says he'll sign an executive order ahead of next year's midterm elections. But that would likely face legal challenges. The Constitution gives states the power to oversee elections, not the federal government. Can the president actually do this?
This is unconstitutional, first, because the Constitution doesn't allow for the president to just willy-nilly take things over. Second, the states are not agents of the federal government.
Trump says he spoke about the issue Friday with Russian President Putin.
Vladimir Putin, smart guy, said you can't have an honest election with mail-in voting.
The president has often railed against the practice.
We're the only country in the world, I believe, I may be wrong, but just about the only country in the world that uses it.
He is wrong. Switzerland, Germany, Greece, the UK, and Austria are among the 34 countries that allow some form of mail-in voting. It all comes amid new protests over the president's federal takeover of Washington, D.C.'s police department and his deployment of the National Guard.
All I want is security for our people.
Now, more Republican-led states, including Mississippi, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Ohio, are sending hundreds of new troops.
What doesn't make sense? The numbers on the ground in the district don't support 1,000 people from other states coming to Washington, D.C.
We're also learning more about who federal agents are arresting. According to the White House, about 40% of the arrests made by federal agents have been undocumented immigrants. The top categories have been drugs and weapons charges. Now, the National Guard troops are not making arrests, but the White House now says that they may be armed to protect federal buildings.
All right, Gabe, thank you. Well, Newsmax is set to pay a $67 million settlement to voting machine company Dominion. The voting company sued the conservative cable network back in 2021, alleging that Newsmax spread baseless claims that Dominion rigged the 2020 presidential election. According to a regulatory filing, the two companies reached an agreement on Friday, which will avoid what was expected to be a high-profile jury trial. Well, in a statement, Newsmax said it, quote, stands by its coverage as fair, balanced, and conducted within professional standards of journalism. This is the second multi-million-dollar settlement the cable network has agreed to pay in an election defamation lawsuit.
Authorities released chilling new surveillance video from a mass stabbing last month in Michigan. It shows the moment that a man ran through the aisles of a Walmart and violently stabbed nearly a dozen shoppers.
NBC News correspondent Maggie Vespa spoke exclusively with one of the victims, and we do want to warn you, the video and images are graphic and disturbing.
Watch as the suspect with the green backpack sneaks up on his first victim, the woman in black. He appears to throw her to the ground, then chase another customer. Authorities say it was just the start of last month's stabbing spree at a Michigan Walmart. The 360-degree video paused and rotated by authorities in Traverse City. The next target, this man in blue. The suspect, identified as 42-year-old Bradford Gilley, then appears to jab his right hand at that man in the jacket who goes flying. Moments later, you see Gilley run left into the pharmacy before appearing to stab someone in frozen foods. This man attacked by a display of cherries. In an exclusive interview with NBC News, victim Erin says he was shopping with his wife and 4 kids when he was attacked.
I thought I was being punched, and after the third one, I noticed that, okay, this isn't a punch, I'm being stabbed.
As a dad, as you're being stabbed, are you just thinking about your kids there?
Really, the only thing that was on my mind when I was being stabbed, it's like, is my wife safe and are my kids safe? And I knew that I was shielding them.
Gilley, moments later, seen running to the parking lot, attacking this woman from behind. Cell phone video later captured a crowd corralling Gilley until authorities came. Investigators say all 11 victims survived. Gilley's pleaded not guilty to assault and terrorism charges. Court records show he has a history of mental health issues. Investigators releasing these photos showing blood in the pharmacy produce section near a display of Oreos. The chilling aftermath of a terrifying attack. Maggie Vespa, NBC News.
Hurricane Erin didn't need to make a direct hit to trigger a tropical storm watch for North Carolina. Communities along the Outer Banks are now being told to evacuate as the storm churns in the Atlantic. The U.S. Air Force sent a plane into Erin's eye wall yesterday afternoon to gather data on the storm. It has lost some of its power, but forecasters say the hurricane will grow substantially in size as it moves over the western Atlantic this week. Now, while Erin isn't expected to make landfall on the U.S. mainland, it will still fuel large waves and dangerous rip currents along the entire eastern seaboard. NBC meteorologist Michelle Grossman now.
Yeah, she's keeping a close eye on Erin for us this morning. Hey, Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Great to see you. And still a major hurricane. We're looking at a Category 3 status with winds at 115 miles per hour. So we're going to keep that strength, at least for the duration over the next couple of days. It's going to weaken a bit, and then it's going to pop back to a Category 3 storm. It slowed down yesterday. Winds, forward movement northwest at 7 miles per hour. We were about 15 miles per hour yesterday. So here's the latest track. We are expecting it to become a Category 2 storm sometime early Wednesday morning. So it will weaken a bit, but still a strong storm at 110 miles per hour, nearly a Category 3 storm. Popping back up to a Category 3 storm on Thursday, Friday, Category 2, and then eventually weakening to a Category 1 storm on Saturday before it becomes an extratropical low. Notice a track is still on its way between the U.S., between Bermuda. That is good news, but Erin really laid it out for us, where we're going to see those impacts up and down the East Coast, especially in the Carolinas and parts of the Mid-Atlantic, even in parts of the Northeast with really high surf, life-threatening rip currents, and also some coastal flooding. Now, what's going to happen here is we're going to see Erin grow in size. So the wind field's going to grow, and we're going to see those increasing waves along the entire East Coast from Jacksonville all the way up to portions of Maine. And it's going to be sunny at some point. So people are going to want to go in the ocean. You really need to listen to those officials because we're going to see some very angry ocean waves as we go throughout the next couple of days, especially Wednesday into Thursday. We have a high risk. That's that red line from Florida all the way to Maine. And we do have some moderate as well. So we're looking at storm surge anywhere from 1 to 3 inches along the mid-Atlantic beaches, the Carolinas. We have a 2 to 4 storm surge that we're expecting, and 1 to 3 as we go further south into portions of South Carolina. There's that expanding wind field. Right now, we're looking at 400-mile tropical force winds extending from the center of Erin. But as we go throughout time, it grows in size. Now we're talking 600 miles, and that's why we're concerned, especially about the Outer Banks, because it's going to touch the Outer Banks, and that's where we're going to see the coastal flooding and the winds gusting. We're going to see winds gusting to tropical storm force levels in Cape Hatteras at the peak, 53 miles per hour, 43 mile per hour wind gusts in Virginia, and even into Maryland. Ocean City, Maryland, we're looking at winds gusting up to 43 miles per hour as well. Back to you guys.
Michelle, thank you so much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.